Well, good morning. Good morning. So one of the questions I'm going to ask the Lord when I get to heaven is why when I come back from a sabbatical I have to speak for like 4 weeks on idolatry. Why is that? Why can't I speak about the love of Jesus and everything else? The reason is because when you talk about idolatry, you're talking about the love of Jesus and how he wants to transition that. You know, we've talked about Elijah and we've talked about Jeremiah, and today we're talking about Daniel, this book of Daniel, and we're talking about the 4th chapter. But here's what I realized. As I read that chapter, it has the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story. It's got the Daniel in the lion's den story. But I did a series on that just 2 years ago because I went back and looked, and I did a series on that. And so today I'm not going to concentrate on that. I'm going to concentrate on this big bad guy called Nebuchadnezzar. He's this king. And today is what I would call the crown jewel of idolatry, in the picture that Nebuchadnezzar gives us about our ability to worship ourselves. So this is kind of a tough thing. It really is. But here's what I want you to know going in. The reason that this is so important for you and for me is we're going to see how Nebuchadnezzar changes. And we're going to see that a foundation of how he changed was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and this guy Daniel. Because what they did early in the book of Daniel is they laid a foundation, a God foundation, because of their relationship with God, because they loved God, because they wanted to follow God, and they would do anything to follow God, including losing their own life. And that testimony, that story created a foundation so that Nebuchadnezzar someday would open his eyes and realize and recognize who God really was. And I want you to understand the importance of that, because you know, just by the very fact that you are here today and you're breathing means that God has a purpose for you. God has a call on your life. There are special things he wants you to do. And all of the stuff that happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to Daniel, all that junk that would be so fearful in your life, created the upper story moment for the living God. And as a matter of fact, when you look at that foundation, you look at these 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and you heard the story, build a statue, worship the statue. They say no, right? As a matter of fact, I want to read you what they said. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand. But I love this. But even if not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that God set up. Testimony, story, thrown into the furnace. Not only did they come out unburned, they came out, they didn't even smell like smoke. Which is interesting that that's recorded. But then here is what Nebuchadnezzar says as a result of this. Long before the story we're talking about today. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for he has sent his angel and rescued his servants." Now listen to this. "No other God can save in this way." Then he promoted them. So you see how crazy Nebuchadnezzar is, but you see early on he gets this view of what the real God can do in people's lives. And then we go to Daniel. Remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den and all that? So Daniel goes into the lion's den, he comes out, and in the very chapter we're talking about today, chapter 4, here's what Nebuchadnezzar, when he calls Daniel to interpret the dream, he says, "The reason I called you is because the spirit of the holy gods is in you." So Daniel, lion's den, Daniel, just give us fruits and water, or vegetables and water, and see if we're stronger. He sees all this. Nebuchadnezzar sees all this, and it creates in him this turmoil, this, oh God, that he's really God. And it's just a totally amazing story about who God is in our lives. And so today we're talking about this guy. We're talking about Nebuchadnezzar because I want you to see that maybe we have, I think, a little bit of Nebuchadnezzar in us. That maybe we have this bent toward self-worship. This bent toward, there's a God and I'm him. is really what it is. You know, I read a book in school. It was written in 1964. It was called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. And it's true story. And actually, there was a movie that either just came out or is coming out with Richard Gere. And he plays the psychiatrist in this movie. And so what the book is about is this case study. It's this case study of these three people who kind of took the Messiah complex off the charts. So these three guys, they believe they're God. They believe that they're the Messiah. And he wants to help them. So he wants to get them to the other side of this where they realize that there is a God, but I'm not him, right? And so what he decides to do is, one of the ways he decides to do it is he says, we're going to have them live together for a couple years. They'll eat together, they'll sleep together, they'll do therapy together and everything else, because the hope is that what's going to happen is one of them would hear the other two talking like this, and they'll say, well, there can't be three of us. And so they start this process. But he discovers it really didn't work that way. Because what would happen is they'd be sitting in a room and they'd be doing their therapy, and one guy would say, yes, I am the Messiah, I'm called to save the world. And the psychiatrist would say, well, okay, well, how do you know that? And he would say, well, God told me. And then one of the other two guys would say, I did no such thing, I didn't tell you that. And so they were fighting with each other all the time, right, about this whole thing. And so you see this, and it just didn't work. He realized it didn't work, and what they did is they kind of continued to live their lives in this like alternate reality, where the world revolved around them. And I thought to myself, if that's all it takes to be considered crazy, then I think a lot of us would be considered crazy, right? Because that's exactly what happens to us. We live in this universe that's all about us, the center of us, and if you don't believe that, just think of how you treat other people, or think of your spending habits, or think of your control issues in life, and you'll realize, wow, I do that all the time. And so as we study Nebuchadnezzar, he is this amazing case study of how we can think of ourselves as God, because he was full of himself. In the last number of weeks, we've talked about idolatry, right? And remember what we talked about idolatry is false substitutes for God, cheap substitutes for God. It's anything I put in place of God in my life. And we think that idolatry is in my life. I mean, I don't make golden images. I hope you don't make golden images, but we have our own golden images, don't we? I mean, man, it can be anything from money to sex to power to people to you name it, and it can take the place of God, can't it? But here's what I want you to catch today. Here's what I want you to understand, that the very foundation, the base foundation of all of those gods is me. Want to get that? The foundation of me stepping away from God is me. And it's like this. It's like my boardroom is a heart. It's my heart. That's where the boardroom of my life lives. And I invite God to the table, right? God can be a part of that discussion, but he's not the CEO. I'm the CEO. I'm the board of directors. I'm the guy, and God can have his input into my life, but he's not going to run my life. But here's what happens with God. The second you give yourself to Jesus, he says to you, I'm firing all the other chairmen of the board. I'm the guy. I'm the CEO of your heart. And I'm not going to let anything get between me and you. And I will jealously guard that, and I'll do whatever I need to do to help you to understand the depth of my love for you, to help you understand that I am your God. That's what we're looking at today when we're looking at this Nebuchadnezzar. And I think as we study the Old Testament, the last few weeks, we've seen how seriously God takes this stuff of idolatry. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he thinks of himself as God. Now, to put in context, kind of what we've been, in context of what we've been studying, remember there's the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Remember the northern kingdom had been destroyed by the Assyrians. And remember the southern kingdom had been destroyed, you know who by? This guy. This king, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he hauls these people away. And what he would do when he hauls these people away is he would pick out the best and the brightest. And he would kind of use them, and they would become like his personal entourage. And so he picks this young guy, this Daniel, 15 years old, 16 years old, smart, sharp guy. And he enters the court of this king of Nebuchadnezzar. That's how Daniel even gets into the whole process of what we're talking about today. And this guy, this Nebuchadnezzar, he had all the power in the Mediterranean. And no one was more feared than him. And he was full of himself. And he's a graphic example of what happens to us when something takes the place of God. In fact, there's this prophet Ezekiel. He was a contemporary of Daniel. In the 28th chapter, he points out what it means to replace God. Listen to what he says. In the pride of your heart, you say, I am a God. I am the one who sits on the throne of a God. But you're a mere mortal. You're not a God, though you think yourself as wise as a God. Now listen to me. The message of Ezekiel, the message of the prophets, the message of the book of Daniel, the message that was given to Nebuchadnezzar is a message I hope that you get today in this congregation. And it's the bottom line. You may want to jot this down. There is a God and you're not him. And I hope you get this. I hope you get this. I mean, it seems obvious, right? Why should I even have to write that down? Well, like I said, look at your life. Look at the focuses of your life. That's what I want to talk about today. Look at how you interact with people. Look at how the way you live. And Ezekiel put it very clearly, you are not God. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to learn this lesson firsthand. And boy, is this a lesson we need to learn in our culture. And the reason is because our culture is increasingly has this tendency to become more self-centered, doesn't it? I was reading a really interesting study this last week, and it's called the NPI. You know what that is? The Narcissistic Personality Inventory. Now, the amazing thing about this is this test has been given for decades. But just within the last number of years, last few years, you know what's happened to this test? It has spiked. People are like getting 100% of this test. This narcissistic personality test. It's just very interesting to me. It's increased in its scores over the last few years. Now, here's how it works. They would come up with a statement. They give comments. And then you're supposed to rate the comments 1 to 5. 1, nah, not so much me. 5, yeah, this is me. And here's some of the questions. If I ruled the world, it would be a better place, scale of 1 to 5. I think I am a special person, scale of 1 to 5. I can live any way I want to, and no one has the right to tell me what to do, scale of 1 to 5. I can be anything I want to be if I really work at it. And there's just been this huge spike in the scores here the last number of years, where people are saying it's all about me. No one can tell me what to do. I tell myself what to do. If I ruled the world, it would be a better place. And it's interesting. One of these psychologists, he was a guy from San Diego State University. It says that the problem is that we have increasingly raised our kids telling them they are special. Now, there is certainly nothing wrong with telling your children they're special. We are all unique. We are special in the eyes of God. We should be special in each other's eyes. But what they do is we don't do it within a context of a social setting, that I have social responsibility, that there's relationships with other people I need to consider, that I really am special, but that specialness better feed into the betterment of society, because if it doesn't, the world becomes an anarchy, right? And it was interesting, one of the tests they gave, it was to a preschool curriculum. Have you ever heard the song Frere Jacques? So these kids start school every day and they come in and they sing to that tune, I am special, look at me, look at me. Every day these kids start this. Now you can see how that could be a problem if that child is taught that they're special, but you don't need to worry about anybody else being special. They're special, but I'm the center of the universe. And that I don't care what happens in society or in any group, in my family, in my school, at church, anywhere. That creates problems. You can see where that would create problems, can't you? And I would say, the reason I even say that, because I think that was Nebuchadnezzar's favorite song. I think he sang it all the time. I think he went on his housetop and he screamed it because Nebuchadnezzar, he wanted everybody to know how important he was, how special he was, how powerful he was. Now, to help you geographically with King Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was in what is today modern-day Iraq, okay? And when you think of a dictator of Iraq, who do you think of? Saddam Hussein, right? Do you know what the nickname Saddam Hussein gave himself? The moniker he wanted to be noted by? Successor to Nebuchadnezzar. Wow. That's what he wanted to be known as. That was his moniker. He said, hey, everybody call me Little Nebuchadnezzar. That's what he really did. That's who he was. It was his mantle. In fact, in Jeremiah 37, you read these stories of this guy, this Nebuchadnezzar. Once he took a king of Judah, and so he tied up this king of Judah, and then he killed all of his family in front of him. And then he poked his eyes out so that the last thing he would be etched on his brain was the destruction of his family. In another place, he took another king of Judah, and he burned him at the stake. That's who this guy was. He was just like this evil tyrant of a man is who he was. And so we saw how the southern kingdom was destroyed by this guy. And then when you begin to read the 4th chapter, you may want to turn to the 4th chapter of Daniel. That's where we're going to pretty much stay today. Or the scriptures will be on the screen as well. But as you look at the 4th chapter of Daniel, you know what's striking about what I'm about to read? What's striking about it is Nebuchadnezzar's the guy that wrote this. He wrote the 4th chapter. It's in first person with him. Let me read to you the end result. He writes this. To the nations and peoples of every language who live on all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs! How mighty are his works! His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. This Saddam Hussein type character, he'd become a worship leader. This guy's like writing worship songs. You say, man, I want to declare the praises of God. And you're thinking, well, what happened? Something happened, right? I mean, that's like waking up tomorrow morning and Howard Stern and Stephen Colbert are declaring repentance and revival for the nation of the United States of America. And you're thinking, well, God, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? And you're looking at this, you say, up to the 4th chapter, we see nothing that would tell us Nebuchadnezzar, this doesn't match what I see. So Nebuchadnezzar's telling what has happened. He learns this very painful lesson through this story that there is a God and I'm not him. So when we get to the 4th verse of Daniel chapter 4, we kind of see that he's kind of at home. He's content. He's prosperous. He doesn't really have a lot to fear. He's surrounded by an army. He has like a 630,000 square foot house. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous. He's got everything he wanted. And then God decides to pay him a visit. The God of the universe decides to pay him a visit. And so he has a dream. And I want you to look at what the dream says. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. And I had a dream that made me afraid. I was lying in a bed, and the images and the visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So this king dreams of this fabulous tree, and it's huge and it's beautiful, and it's got plentiful fruit and all that stuff. Birds have shelter in it, animals and beasts have shelter in it, and all this other stuff. So it's this big, beautiful tree. But then we get to the 13th verse. In the visions I saw, I was lying in bed, and I looked, and there before me was the Holy One, a messenger coming down from heaven. And he called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit, and let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. And then here you go. And let him be drenched with the dew of the heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth, and let his mind be changed from that of a man, and be given the mind of an animal till 7 times have passed for him. Now the 7 times can mean reference to 7 years. We're not going to go into prophecy here, but it could mean 7 years, but 7 is also the number of completion. And when you hear this story, you see how completion happened in this particular story. So Nebuchadnezzar knows this dream is just not good. I mean, he knows it's not just a dream. I mean, it's not like the pizza he ate last night was bad pizza or something like that. He knows that there's something going on here. So he calls the magicians, he calls the interpreters, and he says, what does it mean? And they all say, I don't know. And eventually he gets to this guy, this young guy, this servant, this slave to him. And his name is Daniel. Remember, there's a backstory. And in this backstory, he learned to trust that Daniel maybe has a God that he follows. So he calls on Daniel, and he asks him to interpret the dream, and he can tell Daniel's upset, that he's just not happy with this. And he said, oh, come on, calm down. You know why? Because Nebuchadnezzar is convinced this isn't about him. This is about something else. But After he tells the dream to Daniel, Daniel says in the 22nd verse, he says, "You, O king, are that tree." That tree is about to get cut down to size. Verse 25. "You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth, and He gives them to anyone He wishes." So here's what he's saying: you're going to live like an animal. Life is going to be just completely fall apart for you. And one thing is going to become clear to you, king. There is a God. You're not him. That's really what he's telling him. And you're going to lose it all. You're going to end up lower than you could ever imagine that you could be. And you're going to sink to the depths of the earth. So he gives him this. And we're going to see in a few minutes, he completely blows it off. So here's what I want to do with the rest of our time together. There are some questions that came to me about Nebuchadnezzar's life. And I want to kind of personalize them for you and for me, because I think these questions and maybe the way we answer these questions will help us see that maybe we're a little more like Nebuchadnezzar than we realize. That maybe sometimes the God of me is more prevalent than we really think. So here's question number 1. What is my motivation? Or why do I do what I do? See, for King Nebuchadnezzar, his whole life was about his glory and to impress other people. In Daniel 3, remember the chapter before, he made this big statue, and he said to everybody, if you don't want to die, you worship it. If you want to die, don't worship it. But he just made everybody worship this thing. And we don't know what the statue was. It doesn't say it was a statue of him. It could have been a statue of him. But the whole point of it was, I want you to worship that because I say so. I have the power. I have the authority. I am God in your life. That's what he was saying. And also, I don't know if you know it or not, but he was desperate for the approval of one of his wives. He was responsible for one of the 7 wonders of the world. Have you ever heard of the gardens of Babylon? That's him, that's the guy. So a pretty good resume point, right? So he has a lot going for him, and he's trying to prove himself all over the place. It was about his glory. So why do you do what you do? I don't mean about work. I mean, why do you wear what you wear? Why do you drive what you drive? Why do you live where you live? Why do you sit with the people you sit with? Why do you go to school for the things that you go to school for? Why do you do what you do? And there's another question that you may want to ask yourselves. And it's this: what's my source of strength? What's the source of my success? Because in Nebuchadnezzar's life, guess what the source of his success was? Him. That was completely the source of his success, his own power. In the 30th verse, it says this: by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty. He's looking down on his kingdom and on everything that's there, and he says, I did it. This is all mine. I take credit for all of this. That's what he's really saying. And when we pursue greatness, self-empowerment, give ourselves the credit, we officially become our own God. Isn't that really the definition of being a God? That we bring glory to something other than a living God, and we bring that glory to ourselves? I mean, this happens all the time, folks. And so here's what we do. We have a tendency as human beings to blame God for all the things that go wrong and to take credit for all the things that go right, don't we? Have you ever, any of you know what the Santa Ana winds are? I was taking a class out there a few years ago, and the Santa Ana winds, I mean, when they come and they're strong. And so I go out to my car one day, and I'm in this like parking lot, and I go out to the car and I open up the door, and Santa Ana wind comes and grabs that door, and the door slams against the car next to me. I thought, oh man. So I didn't leave. I actually waited for the guy to come out. And he comes out, we exchange insurance information. I'm thinking, oh man, this is going to cost me. So I call my insurance guy, right? So I'm talking to the insurance guy and say, here's what happened. And you know what he said? It's not your fault. That's not your fault. I'm thinking, it's not my fault. The guy was in the store. I'm out here. I do this. And no, it's not your fault. You know what that really was? What we call it in the insurance industry is we call it a what? An act of God. That's what he said. We're comfortable with this language. God, it's your fault. Yeah, that's not my fault. That's your fault, God. I blame you for this, God. How dare you do that, God? We're comfortable with this. It's an act of God. As long as it's a reference to something bad. Hurricane, tornado, hailstorm, windstorm. It's an act of God. But when it comes to a blessing or a goodness or a prosperity, what do we say? "Man, look what I did. Oh, man, I worked hard at this. You won't believe what I sacrificed to get this done." Very rarely, until we learn that He is God and we're not, do we ever say, "Praise you, Jesus," is the first thing that comes out of our mouth. I mean, that's what happens. And this is what's going on with this guy Nebuchadnezzar. Here's what I accomplished. That's what he's saying. You know, Habakkuk, he was another prophet. He explains people like this. He puts it this way. He says, "They sweep past like the wind, and they go on. They're guilty people." Here you go. They're guilty people whose own strength is their God. Oh. Man, their own strength is their God. They help themselves. They're the source of power. They put the pieces back together. They overcome their struggle. And Habakkuk kind of says in this chapter, he says, "You know what? Yeah. Maybe for a moment they appear to be okay, but quickly they just kind of blow away." That's what he really says. And Nebuchadnezzar relied on his own. He was the secret to his success. Last question. What is the purpose of your life? I always think about that. What is the purpose of your life? What are you really chasing after? You know, we've talked about the last number of weeks some of these things. But we see here with Nebuchadnezzar, we saw with Solomon, you know what they were pursuing all of their life? They were pursuing happiness. They were pursuing satisfaction. How else would you have a 630,000 square foot house? I mean, the master plan didn't show that, but you keep adding on and adding on and adding on and adding on, as maybe another 100,000 square feet will make me happy. That's really what this guy is doing. And that's what happens when you pursue happiness as your God. I mean, isn't one of our rights in America is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I mean, but here's the worst part about happiness. The irony of this is the more you pursue it, the more elusive it becomes, doesn't it? The more I just seek to just be happy, the more I chase it, the more quickly it kind of runs away from me. And I just can't quite grab onto it. And when happiness is our God, it robs us of happiness. And you just find yourself hungry. Unsatisfyingly hungry. And over and over and over you try this and this and this and this to fill that. And it just doesn't. It's the irony of happiness. You have it for 1 second and then you spend the next 5 years looking for it again. Then you have it for 1 second and you spend the next 5 years looking for it. I read this story of this 26-year-old woman that has what's called Prader-Willi syndrome. And what that is it's a disease where one of the genes has a chromosome missing, and it's the chromosome that tells you you're full. 20,000 people in the world have it. And so you eat and you eat and you eat and you eat. When she was 3 years old, she was 50 pounds. When she was 20 years old, she was 300 pounds. And she can't stop. She would literally eat herself to death if someone wasn't there. She's lost jobs over this. She has almost been arrested for stealing candy bars in stores because she can't help it. If someone wasn't there watching her, she would literally kill herself eating. Now that is a physical ailment, worldwide 20,000 people. But there is a spiritual ailment that I think especially in a rich and opulent country like America, we think we're poor. We have a roof over our heads. We have food for our children. But I can't get a Starbucks every day, so something's wrong. I can't go get a steak 4 times a week for $30 a steak, and something's wrong. And we're just discontent. And so spiritually, we eat, and we eat, and we eat all of these things, thinking that it's somehow going to fill us up. And it's a curse. And it's an epidemic. At least in America, it's an epidemic. And it's all based on this fallen human nature. This thing inside of us that wants to replace God with something else. And God isn't quite enough for us, and we don't know what to do with that. And that's what we're seeing with this guy Nebuchadnezzar. He just wanted more. He just wanted more. But he's heading for an encounter with God. There is hope in all this because he's heading for the only one who can satisfy and fill that hunger that's within us. And we see this. And he's tried to force it. He's tried to power his way into it. None of that's worked. So Daniel tells the king, look, you're going to live like a beast in the wilderness. He says you're going to chew on grass just like the cattle. Now, can you imagine the courage it takes for him to do something like this? I mean, if it was me, I'd have probably said something like, king, I think what that means is you've got this big tree in the back 40. And it's got like insects and stuff all over it. And if you don't cut that tree down and get rid of it and do a little bit of gardening, you'll never have the hanging gardens of Babylon. So, king, that's really what, I'd just come up with something. I'd have just, off the top of my head, come up with something. But Daniel doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He says, here's what it means. You're not going to like this, but here's what it means. And it's because of that backstory, it's because of that lower story that Daniel is able to courageously say to him what was going on with that dream that allowed the king to say, the spirit of the holy gods lives within you. Now, he's talking, understand this, he's talking to the king that pokes out eyes, burns people alive, kills families. But that king was helpless in front of Daniel. Why? Because there was a hedge of protection around him. There was the spirit of the living God living through and out of him. And if that king would have wanted to do something, he couldn't have done it. And that is the same with you, isn't it? You know, as you sit here today, some of you are wasting your life because you don't see that Jesus is sitting right next to you right now. You don't see that Jesus has a call on your life right now. You don't see that you can leave here today a different person than when you came in here today. You don't see that he has the power to hold Daniel safe from lions and from food that people would say he should lose weight on, or guys in a furnace not being burned up. He has that same power available to you right now. And you need to understand that what it takes to get to this point of letting him work is you being able to say, you're God and I'm not. Do your thing, God. Because that's where the power comes from, doesn't it? That's where the grace of God overtakes my own humanity. And we're seeing this here. And so Daniel doesn't even stop there. Look at the courage. This isn't in your outline, but I want to read to you what he says. He says, therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. So this hedge around him, listen to what he says to King Nebuchadnezzar. He says to King Nebuchadnezzar, renounce your sins by doing what is right. Oh, smokes. And your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that your prosperity will continue. Is that amazing or what? Saying to the king, repent of your sins, man. Renounce your wickedness. I just love that. I just totally love that. If you don't know what you need to do, you do this, and here's what happens. I was talking with someone this week, and they had a tragedy happen in their life. They had a friend die. And we were talking, and they were saying, I wish I'd have said things differently, because I've had this opportunity to talk to this guy about Jesus. And I wish that I'd have softened my words, and I wish that I'd have done things or said things differently. And I told him, you need to understand that when that person was born, God knew that they were going to try to do this. And so he sent you with the words he gave you to help this guy, to present to him the love of Jesus. And if he did not accept that, you don't know. You may see him in heaven, and he'll say, thank you, because at the last second I realized, I don't know what it means. But I know that God creates us with the temperament he gives us. And certainly we all need to work on how we deal with people, right? We all need to look at how we talk to people. But that doesn't mean that who God created you to be, I mean, I I want the gift set of other people and can't have it. But they want the gift set of me and they can't have that because God gifts us differently. And so we see this Daniel called at the right moment to talk to this king. But what does he do? He completely blows it off. And not surprisingly, because I think when the God is yours, you're your own God, he's on the throne of your heart, you know what happens? That God whispers to you, this doesn't apply to you. It whispers to you, you can get away with it. It whispers it to you, you know what? You're not going to be hurt by this. You can do it just this one time and you'll be okay. You don't need to worry about doing the right or wrong thing. You can just do what you want to do and not have any consequences. Now, maybe other people, maybe they'll have consequences. Maybe, oh, I see what they're doing. They're going to crash and burn. But you're too good for that. That's what we say to ourselves. And we fool ourselves, and that's what's going on here. So he just blows it off. And Daniel, in the 33rd verse, we read about this transformation. So here we go. He was driven away from people, and he ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. So he's sleeping under the stars. Nebuchadnezzar is trying to keep gnats out of his hair. His beautifully manicured and pedicured hands and feet, they become like claws. He lives like the wolfman for years. And then there's this amazing moment. You need to listen to this moment. The change element. The reason he became a worship leader. You need to hear this. At the end of this time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, listen to this, raised my eyes toward heaven. Get that? I raised my eyes toward heaven, and sanity was restored. You want to know the definition of sanity? You want to know what sanity really means? When God takes you through this lower story, and it's awful, and things are falling apart, and you don't know what to do next, and you're looking at the lower story, and you're trying to live in the lower story. Sanity is when you finally look up to Him. When finally you say no. You know what sanity is? That then you don't go back to trying to be your own God. And that's what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. You see, earlier, he blew everything off. He blew Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego off, and their God. He blew Daniel and his ability to do dreams. He blew that off. But then God addressed him personally. And it was because of the backstories of those people, the testimonies of those people, that he was able to grab onto, there's something I need to look to besides all this. And he looked up, and his life was changed. And this guy becomes this worship leader. His life changes, and everything changes from wanting it for himself to wanting the glory of God. And he recognizes that strength isn't in his own power. That strength is the power of the living God. And he realized there is a God, and I'm not him. And I would add to that, thank God, I'm not him. That's exactly what he would have said. And what he begins to do is he begins to follow the advice of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the advice of Daniel, and he begins to become his own testimony. Listen, this church is not my testimony. This church is the testimony of the people of this church. Mark put it very well. There is something special about this church. And what's special about this church is it's the Spirit of the living God that lives here, nothing else. Amen. And if the Spirit of the living God ever leaves this church, God help us. God help us. Because we need the Spirit of the living God. But with Nebuchadnezzar, it took a lot. It just took a lot. So the question I close with today is, what's it going to take for you? What's it going to take for you to realize that there is a God and you're not him? What's it going to take for you to really get out of the driver's seat and let God take that driver's seat? The one God of heaven and earth. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a guy. He had just gotten out of jail. And I love those people. Because there's something so authentic, so genuine, so raw and honest about them. It's beautiful. It's an authenticity I long for in the church. It's an authenticity where we equally can see we're all broken in the same ways. And we begin to talk, and I'm talking about the love and the grace of God, and we're talking about it. You know what he did? He opened up his Bible. He shows me a picture of his family. You know what he said? He said, I did things my way. And I ended up in jail. Now I want to do things God's way. And then he said something that struck me. I just wished I'd have learned back then what I know now. I wished I didn't have to go through all of that stuff to get me where I'm at today. And I almost called him Nebuchadnezzar. Because isn't that exactly the story of Nebuchadnezzar? That he tried all of these things and none of them satisfied him. And then he turns his eyes toward heaven and everything changes. And you know what? I think it would be right for me to say to you that if you're doing things your way, it ain't going to work. It's just not going to work, folks. I mean, you can keep control and you can maybe even build a fairly decent empire for now. But you know what? Sometime you're going to realize that you're not God. Sometime you're going to realize that you're not in control, that everything doesn't belong to you, that you can't fix everything. You can't put together things that are broken sometimes. That it takes somebody beyond you. And you can hold on and you can try to keep control. But at the end of the day, you need to know something. You need to know that someday you're going to realize that the Lord is God. You know what it says in Philippians chapter 2? There is going to come a day where every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. After the first service, someone came to me and they so clarified that for me. You know what she said to me? I often think of that verse and I say, thank you, Jesus, that I'll do that adoring you, not fearing you. Listen to me. You don't need to live as your own God. You don't need to do things your way. Today, you can change your fate. Today, you can do what that convict longed to do. Wished he'd have learned back there what he now knows. Because Jesus is next to you right now. Because Jesus is accessible to you right now. Because Jesus already knows how he wants to change you. He just needs your permission. So we're going to go to our offering now. And I just want us to bow our heads. And I just want you to take a minute. What's it going to take for you? Do you need to do a Nebuchadnezzar experience? Honestly, ask yourself before God now, dear Lord, do I need to go through more junk in order to realize it's not working for me? Do I need to pursue my own way, being my own God, until I get to the end of my rope? And then I pray that please give me the grace not to do that. Give me the grace now to do exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did, to look to heaven, to look to you to change me, transform me. Jesus, take the broken parts of me, the places I don't even know how to reach or get to or change, the healings I don't even know that I need. Define them for me. Let me see them through your eyes. Help me begin to step towards you rather than run away from you. Jesus, today I need you. I need you desperately. I need your protection. I need your provision. I need your power in my life. And oh, how I need your peace. Lord Jesus, come. Come into the heart of every person here today and give them the hope that they too can be a worship leader, that they too have a story that you want to tell through them. I receive your grace, and I thank you for your love. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, folks.